Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover how hypertrophy training can be progressed throughout a mesocycle and if progressive overload actually needs to be applied. Before we get into the details of mesocycle progression, we first need to cover some fundamental training variables for hypertrophy training. We will now cover a few training variables that will have a major impact on muscle growth. The first variable is proximity to failure. This refers to how close each set is taken before reaching failure. This is usually quantified using the RPE or RAR scales, which are simple numerical scales where the trainee subjectively rates how close the set was taken before failure. We generally want to take each set fairly close to failure to maximize muscle growth. This is to ensure all motor units are recruited and all muscle fibers are trained. Leaving too many reps in reserve will simply make each set less effective and require more volume to achieve the same level of hypertrophy. However, we also don't want to take all sets to complete failure at all times, as this is not necessary to recruit all motor units and it can be too systemically and psychologically taxing on the trainee. A practical guideline would be to take sets in the 6 to 12 rep range around 1 to 3 reps before failure and sets in the 12 to 20 rep range around 0 to 2 reps before failure. This is because heavier loads recruit more motor units from the beginning of the set, while lighter loads won't recruit the fast twitch muscle fibers until the slow twitch fibers are fatigued. The next key variable for hypertrophy training is lifting technique. We want to use a technique that allows maximum tension to be placed on the target muscles, and minimal tension placed on other accessory muscles and joints. This will make each set maximally stimulative for the target muscles and will produce the lowest systemic fatigue and local fatigue to other muscle groups. There are a few key points to ensuring lifting technique is maximally effective for muscle hypertrophy. First is to use strict technique. This means avoiding movement of other muscles and joints to assist the lift. Second is to control the eccentric portion. The eccentric doesn't have to be performed extremely slow, it just needs to be controlled enough that gravity isn't doing the work. And third is to use an appropriate load. If the load we use is too heavy, then we can't use the required technique to maximize tension on the target muscle. The next training variable to discuss is rep ranges and loads used. To maximize hypertrophy, there is a large spectrum of rep ranges and loads that we can use. Provided that each set is taken fairly close to failure, we can achieve equal hypertrophy outcomes using rep ranges as low as 6 and as high as 35. However, it is generally impractical to perform sets in the 30 plus rep range, so the majority of training will probably be performed somewhere in the 6 to 20 rep range. Compound lifts that have high stability demands are generally better suited to the 6 to 12 rep range, while isolation lifts with low stability demands are generally better suited to the 12 to 20 rep range. And the last primary training variable for hypertrophy training is volume. For hypertrophy training, volume is best quantified using the number of sets performed per muscle group per week. This is because provided that we are training with a close proximity to failure, technique is strict and effective, and we are working in the 6 to 20 rep range, each set essentially has a similar hypertrophic outcome. Volume seems to follow an inverted U-shaped relationship with hypertrophy. This means that more volume generally results in more muscle growth up to a point, and more volume beyond this point may be too much to handle and the muscle growth response is dulled. So basically there is a sweet spot that results in maximum muscle growth, which we can call maximum adaptive volume. We will explore this idea of volume and hypertrophy further in the rest of this video. So now we understand the most important variables for hypertrophy training, let's now explore the concept of overload and progressive overload. These two terms are similar but have slightly different meanings. Overloading training refers to training that is challenging enough to stimulate adaptation. In relation to hypertrophy training, overloading training simply means doing enough volume to cause a muscle growth response, assuming proximity to failure, technique, and rep ranges are on point. Because muscle growth takes such a long time to achieve, it is very difficult to actually quantify if your current volume level is in fact overloading. However, we can use general indicators that training is overloading, like muscle soreness, strength performance over time, and subjective exertion. So basically there is a minimum level of volume required to see hypertrophy adaptations take place at all. Training with a volume lower than this minimum threshold simply won't allow any muscle growth to occur. There is also an upper limit for hypertrophy training. If we train with too much volume, it is too much stress to actually recover and adapt to, and we also won't see any muscle growth. So basically we want to train in this middle zone of overloading training to achieve hypertrophy gains. The zone of overloading training will change over time, meaning that volume requirements can increase or decrease over the course of a trainee's career. But ultimately, if we are training with volume that is overloading, then by definition, we are stimulating muscle growth. So what is progressive overload then? Progressive overload refers to making training harder over time in some capacity. In relation to hypertrophy training, this may mean increasing the number of reps performed, load lifted, or number of sets performed. Basically, we want to see an increase in lifting performance in the 6 to 20 rep range over time. This can mean performing more reps with the same load, or performing the same number of reps with a heavier load. Progressive overload needs to be achieved for continual improvement of any bodily adaptations. If training never gets any harder, then the body will simply maintain its current level of muscle mass and not continue to grow. With these concepts of overloading training and progressive overload in mind, the question now becomes, how should we progress hypertrophy training from week to week over the mesocycle? While there is no right or wrong way to progress training, I think we can use the concepts that we previously established to draw some logical conclusions. The easiest and most obvious method of progressing hypertrophy training throughout a mesocycle is to have it prescribed in the program. So each week the trainee may increase the load lifted, increase the number of reps performed, or increase the number of sets. For example, let's look at this example 4-week mesocycle for the dumbbell bench press. In week 1, they perform 3 sets of 10 reps with 25 kilos. In week 2, they perform 3 sets of 12 with 25 kilos. In week 3, they perform 4 sets of 10 with 25 kilos. And in week 4, they perform 4 sets of 12 with 25 kilos. So clearly, progressive overload has been applied each week, which results in a more hypertrophic stimulus and will lead to muscle gain over time. However, this method of prescribing progressive overload may cause some issues. First is that we can never predict how a trainee will adapt to a given stimulus over time. This means that if we prescribe a strict progression of reps, sets, or load, it may be too hard or too easy for the trainee. For example, let's say a trainee performs 3 sets of 10 on a dumbbell bench press with 25 kilos, which was absolutely maximal effort. If the program then says they have to perform 3 sets of 11 the next week, they probably won't be able to do it. The second issue is the time course it takes for hypertrophy gains to occur. While novice lifters can generally improve performance from week to week, it can take advanced trainees years just to see true improvements in lifting performance. So if we prescribe a rigid progressive overload plan, it is highly unlikely that an intermediate or advanced trainee will be able to improve performance that quickly. The next issue is that performance fluctuates over time. An individual's performance will not be exactly consistent every single time they train. This may be due to a number of factors like acute fatigue, stress, sleep, mood, time of day, and much more. This again means that a rigid progressive overload structure cannot account for these fluctuations. The other issue is that trainees may adjust their technique or change the load they use for a given exercise. This will alter the number of reps they perform and the load used. For example, if a trainee is using sloppy technique for a seated cable row, they may drop the load slightly and use a more strict and effective technique. While this will probably produce a better stimulus for the back muscles, a rigid progressive overload model won't account for this. Now we've established that prescribing rigid progressive overload may present some issues. So how can progressive overload be applied from week to week in a mesocycle? To understand this, let's look back at the concept of overloading training. To make this simple to understand, let's use an example of one exercise. Let's say a trainee performs 3 sets of a bench press using 70 kilos. Let's say they take each set 1 to 2 reps before failure and perform the following reps. On the first set they get 10 reps, on the second set they get 9 reps, and on the third set they get 8 because fatigue causes a 1 to 2 rep drop off each set. Let's say this exercise with this volume in the context of the entire program is sufficiently overloading. If the trainee now performs the exact same exercise with the same load, same volume, and same proximity to failure for the rest of the mesocycle, then they will probably see some improvements in rep performance over time. For example, the following few weeks may look something like this. As we can see here, everything stays the same, except the trainee now performs 1 to 2 more reps each week because they are adapting to the stimulus. So basically, progressive overload can occur naturally by performing overloading training. This is because once we present a stimulus that is sufficiently overloading, the system has to adapt and improve. Then, because the trainee has become slightly bigger and stronger from the stimulus, they can perform more reps or more weight than previously. This doesn't mean that trainees will improve performance every single training session, but over time we should see a general trend of improved performance. So this cycle can continue and will result in progressive overload without strictly prescribing it. This will allow the training to progress at an individual rate and account for technique adjustments and will consider performance fluctuations. If the trainee is not improving performance over time, then they may need to adjust the program. This may mean increasing or decreasing the volume or changing the exercise. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.